You're just an old man with a motorcycle jacket hanging on your wall. Deputy Caleb Whitmer said those words like they were the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Like 67 years of living, of burying friends, of choosing peace over and over again, when everything inside him screamed otherwise, like none of that counted for a single damn thing. Frank Stone Callahan didn't flinch. He just looked at the deputy the way a mountain looks at weather. And that was the moment Caleb Whitmore made the worst mistake of his life. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens next is something you will not see coming. The morning it started, Frank Callahan was elbow deep in a 1987 Harley Sportster that belonged to a wheat farmer named Dale Hutchins. The transmission had been slipping for 2 weeks, and Dale kept promising himself he'd bring it in, and finally his wife got tired of hearing him complain and drove it to the garage herself. That was Tuesday. By Thursday morning, Frank had the whole lower end apart on the workbench and was humming something low and tuneless, the way he always did when his hands were busy and his mind was quiet. Stone Creek Garage smelled like motor oil and coffee and a little bit of rust, the way all honest garages do. The walls held tools hung in careful rows, not because Frank cared about appearances, but because a man who couldn't find his wrench in the dark wasn't much of a mechanic. There were 2 bays, a small front desk that Jessica ran, a coffee maker that was older than some of the motorcycles Frank worked on, and near the back door hung on a single nail, an old leather vest that nobody asked about twice. Jessica Miller was 26 years old, and she had one of those faces that had seen hard weather young. Not bitter, never bitter, but aware. She'd come to Red Valley 18 months ago with one bag, $300, and a reference letter from a halfway house counselor in Billings who'd written that Jessica was the hardest working person he had ever seen when she decided she was done being afraid. Frank had hired her after a 15-minute conversation and never regretted it once. She had a memory like a steel trap handwriting that could have been architecture, and the kind of calm under pressure that you can't teach. Either a person has it or they don't. That morning, she was at the front desk going through invoices when the patrol car pulled up. Frank heard it first, not the engine, the pause. The engine cut off, but the door didn't open right away, which meant whoever was inside was sitting there deciding something. People who'd already made up their mind don't sit in their cars. Frank set down the clutch housing and wiped his hands on a shop rag. By the time Caleb Whitmore pushed through the front door, Frank was standing at the edge of the bay entrance, close enough to the counter to be polite and far enough from it to not be cornered. Whitmore was the kind of man who filled a room the way smoke fills a room, not because he was big, though he was, not because he was loud, though he could be, but because he came in with the specific gravity of someone who expected the air to move for him. 39 years old, 12 years with the county sheriff's department, the last 4 of those as a deputy who had climbed as high as he was ever going to climb and had decided that meant the territory was his. He had 3 officers with him, none of whom Frank recognized, which was interesting. Whitmore always used rotating personnel for things he didn't want anyone to get comfortable enough to question. "Morning," Frank said. Whitmore didn't answer right away. He stood in the middle of the front area and looked around the way. A man looks at something he's already decided to buy. Turning slow, taking inventory. "Frank Callahan," he finally said, not a question, a declaration. "That's me. Nice little place you got here." He ran his finger across the edge of the front counter, checked for dust, found none. "How long you been operating?" 11 years. 11 years. He nodded like that number meant something specific to him. "Business license current." Jessica looked it up from behind the counter. Her face hadn't changed, hadn't tensed, but her eyes had gone to Frank for just a half second, and Frank had seen it. "Everything's current," Frank said. "I can pull the files if you need them." "I do need them." That was the first signal, not the request itself, but the speed of it. No pleasantries, no explanation, just the flat assertion of authority designed to make a person feel they were already behind, already in the wrong, already explaining themselves before they knew what they were explaining. Frank went to the filing cabinet behind the counter. He found the folder, set it on the counter, pushed it toward Whitmore without a word. Whitmore didn't open it. He let it sit there, looked at Frank instead. "You do any work on vehicles without running them through the books?" "No." "Any cash transactions you might have forgot to document?" "No." Interesting." He finally picked up the folder, flipped it through it the way a man flips through something he's not really reading, then set it back down. I've been hearing some things about this garage. Frank kept his face even. What kind of things? The kind of things that require a follow-up inspection. He smiled for the first time, and it was the smile of a man who had rehearsed it. Nothing to worry about if everything's clean. One of the officers had drifted toward the bay entrance. Frank didn't look at him directly, but he tracked him the way you track weather, steady, peripheral, always knowing where it is. "You're welcome to look at whatever you need," Frank said. "I appreciate that." Whitmore set the folder down finally and looked directly at him with the expression of someone about to get to the real point. "I like to have good relationships with the businesses in this county. Good relationships make everything easier. You know what I mean by good relationships." The room was quiet enough that Frank could hear the coffee maker cycling. "I think I do," Frank said. "I make sure things run smooth for people I have good relationships with. Inspections stay clean. Paperwork doesn't get complicated. Nobody's time gets wasted." He paused. "Red Valley's a small town. A man running a business here, he needs friends." "I've got friends," Frank said. Something moved behind Whitmore's eyes. He'd expected either agreement or obvious fear, and he'd gotten neither. He recalibrated, kept smiling. "Well, good. Then we understand each other. I'll be in touch." He collected his officers and walked out, and the patrol car sat there another 2 minutes before it pulled away, which was its own kind of message. Jessica came around the counter and stood beside Frank, both of them watching the street. "What was that?" she said quietly. "The beginning of something," Frank said. She looked at him. "What kind of something?" He went back to Dale Hutchins's Sportster and picked up the clutch housing, the kind we've handled before. But he knew even as he said it that this was different, because Frank Callahan had spent 20 years staying out of the kind of trouble that walked in through front doors wearing badges. He'd paid his taxes on time, filed every form, answered every question, given every agency every piece of paper they'd ever asked for. He had been by every measurable standard exactly the kind of citizen a quiet man was supposed to be. Deputy Whitmore hadn't come to inspect Stone Creek Garage. He'd come to see if Frank would flinch. The first formal inspection came 4 days later. A county code officer Frank had never seen before showed up with a clipboard and spent 3 hours going through every inch of the property. He documented a storage cabinet that was 2 inches too close to a secondary exit. He noted that one of the bay lights didn't meet the revised lumen standard that had been updated the previous year. He found that the hazardous materials log was using the previous year's form template rather than the current one, a difference Frank's own accountant had never flagged. None of it was serious. All of it was technically accurate. The fine notices arrived 8 days later, 3 of them each for a different violation, each coming from a different department. The amounts were small, a few $100s each, but that wasn't the point, and Frank knew it. The point was the paper trail. The point was the pattern of compliance demands that could be ratcheted up whenever Whitmore decided to turn the pressure higher. Frank paid the fines. He fixed the storage cabinet. He replaced the light. He printed the new form template and updated the log. He documented every correction with photographs and submitted them before the deadline. He did not call a lawyer. Not yet. Instead, he started paying attention. He'd been paying attention to Red Valley for 11 years in the background, the way a man pays attention to weather, not obsessively, but consistently. He knew which businesses were thriving and which ones were struggling. He knew which families had trouble making it to spring. And he knew, though he'd never had reason to examine it closely, that a handful of businesses in town had been running with a smoothness that didn't quite match their circumstances. A bar on the east end of town called Riley's had been losing money for 3 years by every visible measure: slow nights, thin crowds of menu. Nobody talked about, but it had never closed, never missed a payment, and its owner, a nervous man named Gary Finch, looked like someone who slept well only on certain weeks and badly on others. A used car lot on the highway approach had a license that should have lapsed 18 months ago based on what Frank remembered from county renewal cycles. But it was still operating, still putting vehicles on the road. A trailer park on the south side had been cited multiple times by the housing inspector, but the citations were always withdrawn before penalties were assessed. None of these things were proof of anything on their own, but they were the kind of details that clicked into a pattern if a person was willing to look at the whole picture at once. Frank started writing things down. Jessica noticed the change in him before he told her anything. That was characteristic of her. She had the specific alertness of someone who'd grown up in households where noticing things early was survival. She came into the back of the garage on a Wednesday evening after the last customer had left and found Frank at his work table with a yellow legal pad, not a parts list. And she stood there a moment before saying, "You want to tell me what you're putting together?" Frank looked up. He considered briefly whether to tell her it was nothing. "You're old enough to know the truth," he said instead. She pulled over a shop stool and sat down. "I'm listening." He walked her through what he'd noticed. The businesses, the pattern, the way Whitmore's inspection had operated, the professionalism of it, the precision, the use of different officers and different departments, which suggested either that Whitmore had allies throughout the county apparatus or that he had leverage on people in those positions. Jessica was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she said, "Gary Finch, from Riley's. What about him?" "Oh, he came in 3 months ago before you hired me on full time. He was picking up his truck and he was on the phone with someone outside when I was getting his keys and he said," she stopped, pulling the exact words back carefully. "He said, 'I don't have a choice. You know I don't have a choice.' And then he went quiet and just listened, and when he hung up, he looked like someone had taken something away from him." Frank nodded slowly. "That's the mechanism," he said. "That's how it works. First you get someone to do something small. Maybe they look the other way once. Maybe they pay a little extra on a permit and they tell themselves it's a one-time thing. But it's never a one-time thing. Once he has something on you, even if something small, the asks get bigger. And by the time they're big, you're already in too deep to walk away." Jessica was quiet again. Then, "How many people do you think he has?" "In this town?" Frank had thought about it. "Enough, probably enough that nobody thinks they're the only one, but also enough that nobody talks to anybody else because they're all afraid of what the others might say about them." "That's smart," Jessica said with a kind of bleak respect. "Keep everyone isolated." "It always works," Frank said, "until someone decides they have had enough." He said it without particular emphasis, but she heard what was underneath it, and she looked at him steadily. "Are you that someone?" He picked up his pen and made another note on the legal pad. "I'm working on it." The second visit from Whitmore came 11 days after the first. This time there was no pretense of inspection. He came alone late afternoon when the street outside the garage was quiet and there were no customers. He came through the front door, walked to the counter, and set both hands flat on it, and he looked at Frank with an expression that had dropped the performance of politeness entirely. "You're not getting the message," he said. "I got your message fine," Frank said. "I paid the fines. I corrected the violations. That's not the message I'm talking about." Frank looked at him. "Then why don't you say it plainly?" Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "Every business in this county operates with the cooperation of my department. Every business. The ones that understand, that have smooth operations. The ones that don't," he paused, chose the next word deliberately, "they find things get complicated." "Things got complicated once," Frank said. "I handled it. That was a courtesy, an introduction." He straightened up. "The next time won't be." Frank said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that Whitmore wanted a response, either submission or resistance, because either one gave him information. Silence gave him nothing. Whitmore waited, got nothing, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You got any employees?" He said, the shift in direction deliberate. "You know I do. Young woman, Miller." He said her name like a thing he'd looked up, and something in Frank went still. Be a shame if something came up that complicated her situation. Frank's hands were resting at his sides. He kept them there very deliberately, and he kept his voice at the same temperature. It had been all conversation. "She's got nothing to do with this. Everything's got something to do with everything." That's the way things work. He left without another word, and the door swung shut behind him, and Frank stood in the empty garage for a long time after the patrol car pulled away. He had spent 20 years choosing peace. He had spent 20 years believing that a man of enough patience and enough integrity didn't need what he'd left behind. He had believed in the quiet of his days that the world rewarded restraint. He believed that still. But he also believed, had always believed down in the marrow, that there was a difference between restraint and surrender. that the two were not the same thing, that a man who let a threat move past him to land on someone he was responsible for hadn't chosen peace. He'd just chosen which person got hurt. The incident with Jessica happened on a Thursday, 9 days after Whitmore's second visit, and it happened at 7 in the evening, when Frank was finishing up a brake job in the back bay and Jessica was locking up the front. Frank heard raised voices and came through the bay door to find Deputy Whitmore and one officer he didn't know standing in the front room, and Jessica standing behind the counter with her hands flat on the surface and her face completely controlled the way faces go when a person is using every piece of available discipline to stay steady. Whitmore turned when Frank came in. "Just having a conversation with your employee." "About what?" Frank said, and his voice had a texture in it that was new, not loud, not aggressive, but dense, the way air gets before a storm. "She may have been present for some irregular business activity that occurred on these premises. I'm asking her to cooperate with an inquiry." "What irregular activity?" Frank said. "That's what we're trying to determine." Frank looked at Jessica. She met his eyes and gave a very small shake of her head. "He's lying," she was saying, "and I'm not scared, and I haven't said anything. I shouldn't all of it in one tiny motion." "Jessica," Frank said, "you don't have to say anything to anyone without legal representation. You know that." Whitmore's voice sharpened. "This is an informal inquiry. She's not required." "Then she can decline it informally," Frank said. "And if you want to make it formal, you can contact our attorney." He said it even though he didn't have an attorney. He said it because the word had weight, and weight was what the moment required. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, and then he said it, the thing he'd been building to since the first morning, the thing that was designed to diminish, to reduce, to put Frank Callahan in the smallest possible container. "You're just an old man with a motorcycle jacket hanging on your wall." It landed in the room and sat there. Jessica's eyes went to Frank. The officer with Whitmore had gone very still, the way a person goes still when they suddenly realize they might be watching something they can't take back. Frank looked at Whitmore for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, the way you say something that doesn't need volume, "That jacket belongs to men who are no longer alive. I'd choose your next words carefully." Whitmore held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he turned, signaled the officer, and walked out. Jessica let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. "Frank." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." He looked at the back wall at the nail at the old leather vest that had hung there for 11 years without being touched. "No," he said, "but I will be." That night after Jessica had gone home, Frank sat at his work table for a long time without doing anything. He sat with his coffee going cold, and the garage quiet around him, in the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from the moment before a decision. I thought about the men who'd worn vests like that one. He thought about Tommy Reyes, who had been beside him in 3 states across 15 years, and who had died of a stroke at 54 with almost nobody there because they'd all scattered to their separate lives. He thought about Dale Cutter, who had been the steadiest man Frank had ever known, steady like bedrock, and who was gone at 48 from something stupid and fast. He thought about the promises he'd made at funerals, at gravesides in the cold air of Montana and Wyoming and Colorado. "I'll be the one who makes it count. I'll be the one who uses what we built for something worth building." I thought about Jessica Miller, 26 years old, who had rebuilt herself from nothing and who had earned a life where nobody with a badge could walk through her door and manufacture fear out of nothing. He picked up the phone. The number was one he had written in the back of a notebook 11 years ago. When he opened the garage one he had looked at exactly 3 times in those years without dialing it. He dialed it now. It rang twice. The voice that answered was older than Frank remembered it, rougher at the edges, but instantly completely familiar. Stone. Not a question, not surprise exactly, but something close to it, the way you're not surprised when the thing you knew was always possible finally arrives. After all these years. Why now? Frank looked at the vest on the wall. "Because someone forgot what loyalty means," he said, "and I need to remind them." There was a pause. "Then give me 24 hours to make some calls." Frank set the phone down and sat in the quiet garage and finished his cold coffee, and outside Red Valley, Montana was going about its Thursday night the way it always did. Riley's bar doing slow business, the highway carrying trucks south toward the interstate, the houses along the valley road lit up warm against the dark. Nobody knew yet, but something had started moving that would not be stopped. Frank didn't sleep that night. Not from anxiety, he'd moved past anxiety somewhere around midnight, but because his mind was running the way it used to run back when running it mattered, cataloging, calculating, sorting what was real from what was noise. He hadn't used those instincts in years. They came back the way old muscle memory comes back, with a little stiffness at first, and then with a sureness that surprised him. By 4 in the morning, he had filled 7 pages of the legal pad, not with anger, with facts. The facts were what mattered. The facts were what would make the difference between what he was building and what Whitmore had been building, which was a structure made of fear and silence, and the specific human tendency to believe that endurance meant acceptance. Whitmore had been counting on people staying quiet. He had been counting on isolation, each person in their own separate box, convinced they were the only one, convinced that speaking up was the thing that would get them destroyed rather than the thing that might save them. Frank had lived long enough to know that this was how every system like Whitmore's worked. It wasn't unique, it wasn't even clever. It was ancient, and it worked because human beings were wired to protect themselves first and think about the collective second. The only thing that ever broke it was someone willing to go first. Someone willing to say, I know what's happening, and I know you know too, and if we stand together, the thing he's counting on disappears. He picked up the phone again at 7 in the morning and called Gary Finch at Riley's bar. Gary answered on the 4th ring voice, rough with sleep, and something else underneath the sleep that Frank recognized as the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't truly rested in a long time. Gary, Frank said, it's Frank Callahan, Stone Creek Garage. A pause. Frank. The word came out careful, the way a person steps onto ice they're not sure about. I need to talk to you, not on the phone. Can you meet me? Another pause longer. What about the thing you told yourself was a one-time situation? The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of recognition of something clicking into place that the person on the other end had been dreading and half hoping for in equal measure. How do you know about that? Gary said, and his voice was low, so low that Frank knew there was someone else in the building, and Gary didn't want them to hear. Because he came to see me too, Frank said, and I told him no. Gary exhaled. It was almost a laugh, hollow and airless. Frank, you don't understand I understand exactly what he does and how he does it. That's why I'm calling. Frank kept his voice level. I'm not asking you to do anything today. I'm asking you to have a cup of coffee with me and talk. That's all. Another long pause. Then when this morning, 8 o'clock, come through the back. Gary came at 10 past 8, which told Frank that he'd spent 10 minutes sitting in his car deciding and had decided yes. He looked worse than Frank had expected, thinner, the skin around his eyes shadowed and loose, the way a man looks when worry has been eating him from the inside for months. He sat down at Frank's work table with both hands around a coffee mug like it was the only warm thing in the world. How long? Frank asked. Gary stared at the mug. 14 months. What was the first thing? Gary closed his eyes briefly. He pulled me over. I'd had 2 beers. I wasn't impaired, not really. But he had me on the side of the road with a breathalyzer in his hand out, and he told me I could blow or I could have a conversation. So we had a conversation. He opened his eyes. It was $500. I told myself it was a fine. I told myself it was just a fine I paid to the wrong person. And then 3 weeks later, he came to the bar and said he'd heard I was running some inventory off the books. Gary shook his head. I wasn't. You can look at every bottle I've ever purchased and sold. But he said he could make it look like I was, and at that point I already had the first thing hanging over me, so I couldn't exactly go to anyone with clean hands. He picked up the coffee, put it down without drinking. It's been 14 months of that. Every time I think it's the last time, it's not the last time. Frank nodded. He'd known the shape of it before Gary confirmed it. How much all told? Gary said a number. It was large enough that Frank had to keep his face deliberately still. He have anyone else in town? Frank asked. Gary looked at him for a moment, then looked away. I don't know for certain. But Riley's isn't the only bar in town, and mine's the only one that's never had a noise complaint. Never had a fire inspection show up unannounced. Never had a health department visit on a Saturday night when the place is packed. He turned the mug in his hands. I've noticed things, patterns. I just never let myself think about them too long because thinking about them too long meant realizing I wasn't alone in this. And if I wasn't alone, then someone was going to have to do something. And I was too tired and too afraid to be the someone. Frank put his pen down. I'm asking you to write down what you told me. Dates, amounts, everything you remember. You keep it somewhere safe, somewhere that's not your bar and not your house. Gary stared at him. And then what? Then you let me work. Frank, Gary's voice dropped. If Whitmore finds out I talk to anyone. Gary. Frank looked at him steadily. He's already winning. He wins every day you stay quiet. The only question is whether you want to be the person who helped change it or the person who was too scared to. Gary was quiet for a long time. Outside, a truck went past on the main road and the sound faded and the garage settled back into its own particular silence. I'll write it down, Gary said finally, but I'm not signing my name to anything yet. That's fine. For now, writing it down is enough. Gary left at 9:20, still holding himself like a man carrying something heavy. But there was something slightly different in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there when he'd come in, something that had been loosened a fraction, the way a knot loosens when you finally find the right thread to pull. Frank watched him go and then turned back to his legal pad. The thread was pulled. Now he needed to find the others. What Frank did in the next 6 days, he did with the patience that had always been his most underestimated quality. People who didn't know him well assumed that patience was the same as passivity. They were wrong. Patience, real patience, the kind built over decades rather than practiced as a personality trait, was a form of precision. It meant knowing when to move and when to wait, when a word would open a door and when it would slam one shut. It meant trusting the process even when the process felt slow. I didn't approach everyone at once. He started with the people he already knew not well, but well enough that they'd take his call well enough that a cup of coffee didn't require an explanation. He started with the ones whose situations he'd already mapped on the legal pad, the ones whose patterns he'd been watching without meaning to for years. Tom Eckert owned the auto parts distributor 2 blocks off the main road. 61 years old, been in Red Valley his whole life, the kind of man who remembered when the highway went through town instead of around it, and who had 3 photographs of his father on the wall of his office and meant it. Tom had started having issues with his business license renewal 6 months ago, delays that shouldn't have been delays, requests for additional documentation, that the county code didn't actually require a representative from the county assessor's office who'd come out twice to re-verify the property square footage despite it not having changed since 1987. Frank called Tom on a Tuesday morning and said, "You having trouble with the county?" Tom said, "What business is it of yours?" Frank said, "None if you want it to stay that way. But if you're tired of having trouble with the county, maybe we should talk." Tom showed up at the garage at noon with a paper bag of sandwiches from the deli on 5th, which Frank read as Tom's way of making the meeting feel social rather than serious, which was fine. Frank let him keep that. They ate sandwiches at the work table and Tom talked around the edges of it for 20 minutes, the way people do when they're building up to something. And then he finally set down his sandwich and said, "You think he's got other people?" "I know he does," Frank said. "How many?" "Still figuring that out." Tom rubbed his face with both hands. "I paid him twice. Both times I told myself I was handling it. Handling it." He said the word like it tasted bad. "My father ran this business for 30 years and never paid a penny to anybody who didn't earn it. And here I am, 61 years old, and I'm—" He stopped. "You're not the problem," Frank said. "He is. I should have, I don't know, done something different." "Tom, write it down. Dates, amounts, what he said to you. Keep it somewhere he can't get to." Frank paused. "Can I count on you?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, you can." Sandra Hooper ran a small accounting firm out of a renovated house on Birch Street, and she was the most important person Frank reached in those 6 days, not because of her own situation, which was substantial. Whitmore had threatened her professional license over an audit discrepancy that she was almost certain he had manufactured, but because Sandra Hooper was meticulous, was organized, and had over the course of 14 months of being quietly squeezed, kept records that she had not originally kept for any specific purpose, but simply because record-keeping was her nature. She had dates, she had amounts, she had 3 voicemail recordings on an old phone she'd saved because she'd had a feeling, and the feeling had been right. When Frank sat across from her in her office, and she slid a manila folder across the desk without a word, He opened it and felt for the first time since this had started the specific weight of something real. "Why haven't you gone to anyone with this?" he asked. Sandra looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite exhaustion, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "Gone to whom?" "Frank, his department, the county commissioner, who I am now fairly certain is also compromised, the state attorney general's office, which would take 18 months to investigate, while Whitmore continues operating and knows I filed a complaint." "Fair," Frank said. "I didn't keep those records to use someday. I kept them because I thought someday might come." She looked at the folder. "Is this someday?" "I think it might be," Frank said. "And tell me what you need," he told her. She listened without interrupting, without asking questions she didn't need answers to, without the qualifications and hesitations that Gary and Tom had offered, not from cowardice, but from the natural human desire to buy a little more time before committing to something that couldn't be uncommitted. When he was done, Sandra said, "The voicemails are on that phone, the battery's dead, but the files are there. I'll need a few days to organize the documentation into something coherent." She paused. "I'll also need to know that when this moves forward, it moves with enough weight that it doesn't stop halfway." Frank thought about the phone call he'd made 2 nights ago. He thought about the voice on the other end, older and rougher than he remembered, and the words, "Give me 24 hours. "It'll have weight," he said. He didn't explain more than that, not yet. So, the second major development came from a direction Frank hadn't anticipated, which was the direction things usually came from when they were real rather than arranged. Jessica was the one who found it. She'd been doing her own quiet work in parallel with Frank's, which he'd known about and hadn't discouraged because he also knew that telling Jessica Miller not to do something she'd already decided to do was approximately as effective as telling whether or not to change. She'd been talking to people carefully over time, the way she talked to everyone, with a particular quality of attention that made people feel genuinely heard rather than interviewed. She talked to the woman who ran the laundromat, and to the couple who owned the flower shop, and to the old man who sat outside the hardware store every afternoon because he'd sold the hardware store 2 years ago, but hadn't quite stopped thinking of it as his. What she found 9 days after Whitmore's second visit was a pattern she brought to Frank on a Thursday morning, with both hands on his work table and her eyes carrying something he hadn't seen in them before. Not fear, but fury, the cold, organized kind. "The trailer park on the south side," she said. "Ridgeline Properties." "What about it?" "I talked to 3 families who live there. Whitmore has been going out there personally, not with the housing inspector, personally, and telling residents that there have been complaints about their units, and that if they want to avoid eviction proceedings, they should talk to him about it." She paused to let that land. "The complaints don't exist. He's manufacturing them. And the conversation he wants to have about it costs them $300, and their silence about anything they've ever seen him do." Frank sat very still. These weren't business owners. These weren't people with licenses and assets and professional standing that gave them at least some leverage. These were people who couldn't afford $300, who couldn't afford to have the housing inspector find a real reason to evict them, who had no attorney and no filing cabinet full of records and no professional network to lean on. These were the people Whitmore was most afraid of, nobody fighting for. "How many families?" Frank said. "That I know about 7. There are probably more." "Did they give you anything I can use?" "2 of them will talk to someone they trust, not officially, not yet, but they want to know someone knows." She looked at him. "Someone does know, right?" "Someone does know," Frank said. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the release of a tension she'd been holding without quite naming it. "Okay," she said. "Good, because I need to believe we're actually going to do something about this." "We are," Frank said. "Then Jessica." She stopped. "He's going to find out we've been talking to people. It's not a question of if. It's a question of when, and when he does, he's going to come after you specifically." Her chin came up slightly. "I know that. I need you to be ready for that." "I'm ready," she said. "I've been ready my whole life for someone to try to scare me into being quiet. The difference now is that this time I've got someone standing next to me." He looked at her for a moment. "You've got more than one person," he said. He didn't explain what he meant. He'd explain soon enough, but he needed one more thing in place first. The thing he needed arrived on a Friday evening, 12 days after Whitmore's second visit, in the form of a phone call from a number he didn't recognize, which he almost didn't answer. He answered it. "Stone." The voice was female, brisk, professionally controlled. My name is Karen Velez. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in Helena. I've been given your name by someone who says you have information relevant to an ongoing inquiry. Frank sat down slowly. What kind of inquiry? The kind that's been sitting on our desk for 7 months without enough to move on. She paused. Deputy Caleb Whitmore. Extortion, abuse of authority, potential civil rights violations. We've known he exists. We haven't had enough people willing to go on record. Frank looked at his legal pad at the 7 pages of notes at Sandra Hooper's folder sitting in the locked drawer of his filing cabinet. How many would be enough, he asked. Enough that when we move with something that doesn't give him room to maneuver. A beat. Right now you have business owners, you have financial documentation. I know, because that's what your contact in Helena told me. Another beat, this one longer. What I need is scale. I need it to be clear that this isn't a dispute between a deputy and a handful of business owners. I need it to be clear that what Whitmore has been doing is systematic. The trailer park families, Frank said. A pause. What trailer park families? Frank told her. He gave her what Jessica had given him, which was names of 2 families willing to speak and 5 who were not yet but might be reached with the right approach. He heard her writing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, how did you find all this? I've been living in this town for 11 years, Frank said. I just started paying attention. I need something else from you, Velez said. I need you to hold what you've built together. Don't let anyone go cold on us. Don't let Whitmore get wind of this before we're ready to move. What's your timeline? We need 3 weeks, possibly 4. He's not going to wait 3 weeks before he escalates. I know that, she said, which is why I'm asking whether you have the capacity to hold this together until we can move. Frank thought about Gary Finch and his hollow laugh and his hands around a coffee mug. He thought about Sandra Hooper in her manila folder and the word someday. He thought about the families in the trailer park who'd given Jessica their names and their trust. He thought about Jessica herself, 26 years old, chin up ready. I thought about the phone call he'd made 11 nights ago and the voice that had said, give me 24 hours, and the fact that no follow-up call had come yet because no follow-up call was needed. The follow-up wasn't going to be a call. I can hold it together, Frank said. Good, said Agent Velez. I'll be in touch. She hung up, and Frank sat in the quiet garage with the phone in his hand and looked at the legal pad and felt for the first time since this had started that the ground beneath all of this was solid enough to stand on. But the ground was about to shake first. He knew that. Because 3 days after that call, Deputy Whitmore stopped being subtle. It started with Jessica's car. She came in on a Monday morning to find all 4 tires flat, not punctured valves removed, which took longer and was more deliberate and was designed to communicate that whoever had done it had spent time in a parking lot in the dark being careful and specific. She stood beside the car for a moment, looked at it, then walked inside and told Frank without any audible emotion in her voice. Frank came out and looked. He took photographs. He called a tow and had the car brought into the bay and documented everything with the precision Sandra Hooper had taught him without knowing she taught him anything. Then he called Agent Velez and left a message and went back to work. 2 days later, a county code officer showed up at the garage again, the same one from the first inspection, and this time he found a violation in the electrical panel. In the back bay, a wiring issue that Frank was nearly certain had not existed 3 weeks ago, and that he was completely certain would require a licensed electrician and a multi-week repair process that would close that bay entirely. Frank looked at the notice. He looked at the code officer who had the expression of a man following instructions he hadn't written and wasn't comfortable with. You file what you need to file, Frank said quietly, but understand that I'm documenting everything. The code officer said nothing. He finished his paperwork and left quickly. Agent Velez returned his call that afternoon. Frank told her about the car. He told her about the electrical violation. He told her that the pressure was escalating in real time. Can you prove the electrical issue was manufactured? She asked. I can get the electrician who wired that panel 15 years ago to come look at it and testify to its prior condition, Frank said. Do that, she said. And Frank, this acceleration is actually useful. It shows a pattern of retaliation. That's something we can use. I understand that, Frank said. But I need you to understand that there are people here who are scared right now. Real scared. And I need them to stay steady. How are you going to keep them steady? Frank looked at the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at the wall, at the nail, at the vest. I've got something coming, he said. Something that will remind everyone that they're not alone. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Because the thing he'd set in motion 11 nights ago was already in motion, already crossing state lines, already traveling the way. Certain kinds of loyalty travel not by announcement, not by ceremony, but by the simple and ancient and completely reliable mechanism of one man calling another and saying one of ours needs us. And across Wyoming and Idaho and Colorado and the wide open stretches of Montana, engines were warming up. Not yet, but soon. Whitmore came back on a Wednesday, and this time he didn't bother with code officers or pretexts. He came alone without a patrol car in a personal vehicle at 6:45 in the evening when the garage was locked and Frank was finishing a last cup of coffee before heading home, and he knocked on the side door like someone who decided that the performance was over. Frank opened it. They stood in the doorway and looked at each other, and there was something different in Whitmore's face. Not anger, not arrogance, but a brittleness underneath it. The kind that appears in a person when the thing they've built is starting to feel less solid than they counted on. You've been talking to people, Whitmore said. Frank said nothing. That's a mistake. Whitmore's jaw was tight. Whatever you think you're building, it's not going to work. Nobody in this town is going to go on record against me. They've got too much to lose, and they know it. You might have convinced a couple of people to write things in notebooks, but notebooks don't go anywhere without someone willing to stand up in a room and say their name. Frank looked at him. You done? Whitmore blinked. The response wasn't what he'd constructed for. He'd built a sentence designed to generate fear or defiance, both of which he knew how to handle. Simple dismissal was something else. I'm giving you a chance to stop, Whitmore said, and now there was something nakedly threatening in it, the politeness stripped back entirely. Last chance. Frank looked at him for a long moment, and then he said something he hadn't planned to say, but that came out of the place where things are true. Caleb, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about who you are at 2 in the morning when the day's done and there's nobody watching. Because I know who I am and I know what's coming. And the only thing I want to say to you right now is that the time you've got to think about this is shorter than you think. Whitmore stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite fear, but its neighbor. He walked back to his car without another word. Frank locked the side door and stood in the garage and listened to the engines start and pull away. Then he sat down at his work table and called the number from 12 days ago. It's Stone, he said when the same voice answered. What's the ETA? There was a pause, then 3 days, maybe 2 if the weather holds through Wyoming. Frank exhaled. Tell them to take their time. Tell them to ride safe. They know, the voice said. They've been waiting a long time to ride towards something worth riding toward. Frank set the phone down. He sat in the quiet garage and heard in his memory the sound he hadn't heard in 20 years, the specific sound of that many motorcycles moving together. Not chaotic, not random, but coordinated, intentional. The sound of something that would not be stopped. He picked up the phone again and called Jessica. She answered on the second ring. Frank, you still want to know what's coming, he said. A pause. Yeah, I do. Then be at the garage early Saturday morning. He paused. And tell Gary Finch and Tom Eckert and Sandra Hooper the same thing. What's happening Saturday? Frank looked at the vest on the wall. Something that's going to remind this town, he said, that some people you don't get to walk over. Some people still have people. Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of morning where the air has a bite to it that wakes you up before coffee does. Frank was at the garage by 5:30. He wasn't nervous. Nerves required uncertainty, and Frank had moved past uncertainty somewhere in the middle of the week. What he felt instead was the particular stillness of a man who has set something in motion and is now watching it complete itself. I'm out of coffee. He unlocked the side bay. He pulled out 4 folding chairs and arranged them around the work table, then looked at them and added a 5th because Gary Finch always needed a chair that wasn't too close to anyone else. Then he stood by the coffee maker and waited. Jessica arrived at 6, which he'd expected. She came through the side door with both hands wrapped around a travel mug she'd brought from home, and she stopped just inside the door and looked at him with an expression that said she hadn't slept much either. Tell me what's actually happening today, she said. People are coming, Frank said. What people? My people. He poured her a coffee anyway and set it on the work table. The ones I told you about the other night. Jessica set down her travel mug and picked up his. You mean the ones from before the garage? Yes, she thought about that. How many? Frank looked at her steadily. A lot. She studied his face, reading the weight behind those two words, and then she nodded slowly, once the way she nodded, when she'd processed something and decided she could hold it. Okay, she said. Gary Finch arrived at 6:20, looking like he dressed in the dark, which he probably had. Tom Eckert came at 6:35 with a thermos of his own coffee and the expression of a man who had made a decision in the night and was now committed enough to show up, but still working out how he felt about it. Sandra Hooper was last at 10 minutes to 7, and she came in carrying a leather portfolio that Frank was fairly sure contained copies of everything in her manila folder, which told him that Sandra Hooper did not go anywhere important without documentation. They gathered around the work table, and Frank stood at the head of it and looked at all of them, Gary with his hands around a mug, Tom with his arms crossed and his face set, Sandra with her portfolio on her knees, Jessica sitting straight with both feet flat on the floor. I'm going to tell you something, Frank said, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Nobody spoke. 3 weeks ago, I made a phone call, a number I hadn't dialed in 20 years. The person I called made other calls. Those calls went to Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, and across Montana. He paused. Today, somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning, those calls started showing up in Red Valley. Gary looked up from his mug. What do you mean showing up? As if in answer, and Frank hadn't planned the timing, but he couldn't have planned it better, the first sound reached them. Distant, low textured, the unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines. Multiple, more than a few, more than a dozen, approaching from the highway. The sound built the way a river builds when you're standing downstream and the flow is coming towards you gradually at first, then all at once until it filled the air entirely and pressed against the walls of the garage. Gary Finch stood up from his chair. Tom Eckert uncrossed his arms. Sandra Hooper opened her portfolio and then closed it again because this was not a moment for documentation. And Jessica walked to the side door and opened it and stood looking out, and what she saw made her go absolutely still. From the highway approach into Red Valley, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, came motorcycles. Not 10, not 20, not 50. They came in formation, not military, not rigid, but organized the way experienced riders organize when they're making a point with their presence, and they want that point legible from a distance. They filled the road from shoulder to shoulder, and behind the first wave came more, and behind those came more still, and the sound of them was enormous and grounded, and had the quality of something that couldn't be argued with. Frank, Jessica said, and her voice had something in it he'd never heard from her. Not fear, not exactly, but the particular awe of someone watching a thing they had no frame of reference for. Frank, how many are there? Last count I got, Frank said, coming to stand beside her, 590. The number sat in the air. Gary made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. Tom said something under his breath that Frank didn't catch. Sandra stood and came to the door and looked, and then she said very quietly, "Good Lord." "They're not here to cause trouble," Frank said. "I need you all to understand that first. Nobody's going to throw a punch or threaten anyone or do anything that gives Whitmore a single thing to use. They're here because they're witnesses, because the one thing a man like Whitmore cannot operate against is witnesses. He survives in the dark. He does not survive in a room with 590 pairs of eyes on him." The motorcycles were pulling off the highway now, finding space along the main road, along the side streets, some going around to the lot behind the hardware store, filling Red Valley with themselves, quietly and methodically parking and shutting off engines and standing beside their bikes with the specific stillness of people who had come a long way and knew exactly why they'd come. Gary sat back down. He put his face in his hands. Then he took his hands away and he looked at Frank with an expression that was raw and unguarded in a way Gary Finch probably hadn't let his face be in a very long time. "You called them for him," he said. "I called them for me," Frank said. "And because of you, there's a difference." The man who came through the side door at 7:15 was named Deke Harmon, and he was 63 years old and built like a man who'd been doing hard physical work his entire adult life and had no plans to stop. He had a gray beard trim, close a face that had weathered everything. Weather could do to a face and eyes that were steady and warm and missed nothing. He came in and found Frank and put both hands on his shoulders and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. And Frank looked back, and 20 years collapsed into that look and then expanded back out. And then Deke pulled him in, and they embraced the way men embrace when the gap between meetings has been long enough that the reunion feels like something that almost didn't happen. "You look old," Deke said, pulling back. "Look who's talking," Frank said. Deke grinned. It was the same grin Frank remembered, quick, genuine, gone, almost before you caught it. He looked around the garage at Jessica and Gary and Tom and Sandra, and he nodded at each of them with the natural ease of a man who was comfortable walking into rooms he didn't know. "This is the crew," he said to Frank. "Part of it. Good people," Frank looked at them. "Best people." Deke nodded again. "All right." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone, checked something on the screen. "Everyone's settled. Mitch has the east end of Main Torres, has the south approach. Carla's managing the lot behind the hardware store. Nobody's moving until you say move." "Nobody moves until I say," Frank confirmed. "That's the deal." Deke pocketed the phone. "You want to tell me what the play is?" Frank sat down at the work table, and the others gathered closer, and he laid it out. Agent Velez. The documentation Sandra had, Gary's testimony. The trailer park family's Jessica had reached the electrician who'd already agreed to come look at the manufactured violation. He laid it out methodically the way he'd assembled it over 3 weeks, and Deke listened without interrupting, which had always been one of Deke's best qualities. He was a man who understood that listening completely was more useful than asking questions while the other person was still talking. When Frank finished, Deke said, "The federal agent, she's actually running something. She's been running something for 7 months. We're what she needed to move it forward. And Whitmore, he know yet?" "He'll know within the hour," Frank said. "Someone in town will call him. Maybe someone who's afraid of us. Maybe someone who's afraid of him. Either way, he'll know." Deke was quiet for a moment. "What do you expect him to do?" Frank thought about the brittleness he'd seen in Whitmore's face 3 days ago. The way the arrogance had started to develop cracks, the way a man's certainty shows its fault lines when the ground shifts under him. "He's going to try to make an incident," Frank said. "He's going to try to manufacture something disorderly. Conduct, blocking traffic, something he can use to get us all out of here and himself back in control. He needs to be the one with authority in this situation because without authority, he's got nothing. And you want to give him nothing to grab onto," Deke said. "Everyone stays calm. Nobody engages. If he comes here and tries to talk, I'm the only one who talks." He looked at Deke. "Can you hold 590 people to that?" Deke smiled. "Stone, I've held them through things a lot harder than staying calm in a parking lot." He stood. "We've got this." The call came at 8:47, Frank's phone unknown number, and he knew before he answered it that it was Whitmore, because Whitmore was the kind of man who made calls from other people's phones when he wanted plausible distance. He answered, "Callahan. What the hell is going on in my town?" Not a question. The voice was tight, controlled on the surface, and something much less controlled underneath. Frank could hear the effort it was taking. "People came to visit," Frank said. "They're not doing anything illegal. 500 bikers parked along my main road is a public safety issue." 590, Frank said, "and they're parked legally, engines off, no violations." A pause, the kind of pause that happens when a man is recalculating. "What do you want, Callahan?" "I want what I've always wanted," Frank said, "for people to be left alone, for the businesses in this town to operate without paying tribute to anyone, for a 26-year-old woman who's worked hard to build something to be able to come to work in the morning without being threatened." He kept his voice even and unhurried. "I want you to understand that the time for this to be a quiet problem between you and a handful of people who are too afraid to talk is over. You have any idea what you're doing? You're obstructing." "I'm not obstructing anything. I'm exercising my right to have guests. That's all this is, Caleb." He used the first name deliberately because Whitmore had always used surnames to establish hierarchy, and Frank was done playing that game. "Guests." Another pause longer. "This isn't over," Whitmore said. "No." Frank agreed. "It's not, but it's different now. Everything's different now." He hung up. Jessica had been watching him from across the room. "How'd he sound?" Frank set the phone on the table. "Scared," he said. "For the first time, actually scared." She absorbed that. "Good." What happened next was the thing Frank hadn't fully anticipated. Not because he hadn't thought about it, but because thinking about it and living it were different. The way reading about water is different from standing in it. The people of Red Valley came out. Not all of them, not at first. But they came out to their doorways, and they came out to their business fronts, and they stood on the sidewalk and looked at the motorcycles and the riders standing beside them. Quiet and still and present, and they started talking to each other. Quietly at first, the way people talk when they're not sure if they're allowed to say the thing they're about to say, and then less quietly. A woman Frank didn't know came to the garage door and asked Jessica if it was true that Frank Callahan had brought these people here because of what Whitmore had been doing. Jessica said it was true. The woman stood there for a moment and then said, "He did the same thing to us 2 years ago. My husband and I have never told anyone." Jessica took her inside and sat her down and got her a coffee and listened. That was how it started. One person and then another arriving at the garage because the garage was the center of gravity. Because Frank was the center of gravity. Because something had shifted in Red Valley in the past hour that hadn't been shifted before, the specific shift that happens when people realize simultaneously that the thing they thought they were enduring alone, they were enduring together. By 10 in the morning, Frank had 7 new names he hadn't had before. By 11, he had 11. Sandra Hooper had moved to the corner of the room and was taking careful notes in the organized architectural handwriting of someone who understood that everything being said in this room was potentially evidence. Tommy Eckert got on his phone at 10:30 and called a man he'd been afraid to call for 8 months, another business owner who'd been paying Whitmore and who Tom had suspected but never approached. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Tom hung up, he crossed the room and told Frank, "Ray Delgado, hardware store. He's been paying since spring of last year. He's got documentation." Frank nodded. "Tell him to bring it here." Ray Delgado arrived at 11:15 with a shoebox. When Frank opened the shoebox and saw what was in it, receipts, handwritten notes. 2 photographs Ray had taken with a shaking hand through his office window. He felt something that he hadn't felt in 3 weeks of building this thing, the specific satisfaction of a structure becoming strong enough to hold weight. He called Agent Velez. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been waiting. "It's moving faster than 3 weeks, he said. "I know," she said. "I've had someone in Red Valley since yesterday." Frank went still. "What? We've had an observer in town, not anyone you'd identify as federal. Just someone watching." A pause. "The arrival this morning, was it changed the equation, Frank? The scale of it, the peaceful assembly, the people who was now coming forward." He could hear papers moving, the sound of someone in a controlled hurry. "I need you to do something for me. Tell me. Keep them there. Keep everyone there. I need until 2 o'clock this afternoon. I've got an authorization I've been waiting months to execute, and I can execute it today if I have what's in that garage and what's still coming through your door." Frank looked at the room, at Sandra's careful notes, at the shoebox from Ray Delgado, at the 11 new names he hadn't had 3 hours ago, at Jessica, who was sitting with the woman from the doorway, and whose face was doing the thing it did when she was giving someone her complete, undivided, unperformative attention. "I can keep them here until 2, Frank said. "There's one more thing," Velez said, and her voice changed register slightly, not softer but more direct. "The way a person speaks when they're telling you something that required a decision to share. Whitmore knows we've been looking at him. Not from you, he's known for months. He's been moving money, restructuring some of his arrangements. He has a lawyer, and if we don't move in the next 24 hours, his lawyer is going to have an agreement that puts most of what he's been doing in a gray area that takes us 2 years to litigate." The room felt very quiet suddenly. "So today isn't just good timing," Frank said. "Today might be the only day," Velez said. "If it closes today, it closes cleanly. If it doesn't close today..." She stopped. Frank understood. "It closes today," he said. He hung up and looked at Deke, who had been standing at a slight distance during the call with the practiced awareness of someone who reads a room and knows when to be close and when to give space. "Change of plans," Frank said. Deke came closer. "I need everyone to stay until 2 o'clock, not as a presence, as witnesses. I need them available to speak to federal agents if asked." Deke looked at him for a moment. "You're telling me the feds are moving today?" "Today." Something moved in Deke's face, satisfaction maybe, or the particular relief of a long road that's finally reached its destination. I'll let them know, he said. Nobody leaves until you say. The moment that broke the day open came at 12:43. Frank was at the work table working through the new documentation with Sandra when his phone rang. Jessica's name on the screen. He picked up immediately. Frank, her voice was controlled but had a thinness to it, a careful steadiness that told him something had happened and she was managing her reaction. He's here. Frank stood up. Where? Main Road. He pulled up in a patrol car, full uniform, 2 officers with him. He's standing in the road looking at everyone. A pause. Frank, he's trying to talk to people. He's going around to riders and asking for identification and telling people they're creating a public disturbance. Frank was already moving. Tell Deke. Already done. Deke's watching him. Nobody's responding. Good, I'm coming out. He came through the side door and walked to the main road, and the crowd parted for him. Naturally, not performatively. Just the practical parting of people who see someone moving with purpose and get out of the way. He walked until he could see Whitmore clearly. Whitmore was standing in the middle of the road, and the picture he made was one Frank absorbed in a fraction of a second. The uniform pressed and correct the stance, tempting authority, and around him in every direction, parked along every available space on both sides of the road. 590 motorcycles and 590 people who were watching him with a stillness that was more unnerving than any noise could have been. He looked like a man who had brought a sentence to a conversation and discovered the conversation was in a language he didn't speak. Frank walked to within 15 feet of him and stopped. Whitmore turned. When he saw Frank, something moved across his face. Not fear, not yet, but the look of a man whose last solid ground has just shifted. Call them off, Whitmore said. There's nobody to call off, Frank said. These people came here on their own. They're standing on public property. They're doing nothing illegal. He kept his voice the same temperature it always was. If you see a law being broken, arrest someone. If you don't, I'd suggest you think carefully about what you do next. Whitmore's jaw worked. The 2 officers with him were standing back slightly, and Frank noted for the file marked it that neither of them had moved toward any of the assembled crowd. They were following rather than initiating, which told him that whatever Whitmore had told them this morning to get them out here, it hadn't been the whole truth, and they were now looking at the whole truth and deciding how they felt about it. This is not over, Whitmore said, and the words came out thinner than they'd come out 3 days ago. You keep saying that, Frank said. I keep agreeing with you. He held Whitmore's gaze for a long moment, and this was the thing Frank had thought about, the thing he'd decided was the right move, not out of cruelty, but out of the specific mercy of clarity. He said, Caleb, there's a federal agent named Karen Velez who'd like to talk to you. I'd recommend calling your lawyer before that conversation happens. He watched the name land. Velez. He'd given it deliberately, specifically a name Whitmore already knew, had been afraid of for months, had been maneuvering around for 7 months while she built what she needed, and he tried to stay ahead of it. He watched the recognition cross Whitmore's face, and behind the recognition, the specific look of a man realizing that the timetable he'd been counting on had just been moved up. Without a word, Whitmore turned and walked back to his patrol car. The 2 officers stood for a moment looking at each other, then looking at the assembled crowd, then looking at Frank. One of them, younger, maybe 28, something uncertain and honest in his face, looked at Frank with an expression that was asking something without words. Frank looked back at him steadily. If you've been wanting to do the right thing, he said quietly, this is probably the time. The younger officer swallowed, nodded once barely perceptibly, and then he pulled out his own phone and walked away from the patrol car, which was itself an answer to every question his expression had been asking. At 1:52 in the afternoon, Agent Karen Velez walked through the side door of Stone Creek Garage. She was shorter than Frank had imagined from her voice, early 40s. Dark hair pulled back, the kind of face that was deliberately unremarkable in a way that was its own kind of remarkable. She had 2 people with her, both in civilian clothes, both carrying the contained energy of people who were doing something they'd been waiting to do for a while. She looked at the room, Sandra's documentation spread across the table, Sandra herself organizing it with the precision of a surgeon, Ray Delgado's shoebox, Gary Finch in his chair with his hands finally still, Tom Eckert standing with his arms no longer crossed, Jessica standing beside the woman from the doorway who'd started something that had brought 11 more names through the doors since this morning. Velez looked at Frank. You built something, she said. People were ready to build it, Frank said. I just found them. She looked at the documentation. Is this everything? Sandra can walk you through it, Frank said. She organized it. She knows it better than I do at this point. Sandra stood up with the portfolio in her hands and looked at Velez with an expression of professional recognition. Two careful, precise women who had been doing their own parallel work toward the same thing. I've cross-referenced everything by date and by incident type, Sandra said. If you want to start with the financial evidence or the intimidation pattern, I can take you either direction. Velez almost smiled. Financial, she said. Start with financial. Frank stepped back and let them work. He went and stood beside Jessica, who was watching it all with the expression of someone who was watching a thing they've invested in begin to pay out. Is this it? She asked low enough that only he could hear. This is it, he said. It actually worked. It worked because of everybody in this room, Frank said, and everybody standing outside. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Frank, when you made that phone call 3 weeks ago, were you sure it would come to this? He thought about that honestly. I was sure that making the call was right. I wasn't sure of anything else. She looked at him. That's the part that gets me, she said. You did all of this without knowing how it would end. That's the only way you do anything that matters, he said. Outside, the sound of motorcycles had settled into a kind of ambient presence. Not loud, not obtrusive, just there the way something is there when it's decided to be there and isn't going anywhere until it's ready. 590 people standing in the afternoon sun in Red Valley, Montana, having ridden from 4 states to stand for a man who'd spent 20 years choosing peace. And now the peace was costing something the way real peace always does, not quiet endurance, not looking away, not the false peace of letting wrong things stand unchallenged, but the actual peace that you have to fight to build and fight to keep and fight to protect for the people who need it. Dake came through the store at 2:15 and stood beside Frank, and they watched Agent Velez and Sandra working through the documentation together. Heard Velez on her phone speaking in short, precise sentences that were authorizations. Frank could tell from the rhythm of them, the way they landed, and Deke said quietly, "You did right, Stone." "You all did right," Frank said. "Coming here, I know what it cost people to ride this far." "It cost us nothing," Dake said. "That's what you never understood about us. Even after everything you never understood. There's nowhere we wouldn't ride for one of our own." He paused. "And you're still one of ours. 20 years or 200 years, it doesn't change." Frank looked at the wall where the vest hung on its nail. He'd looked at it 3 weeks ago and made a decision. He'd looked at it as something from a past life, something he'd set down and meant to leave down. But Deke was right that he'd never fully understood. Not until now. Not until 590 people rode across 4 states on a Saturday morning for no reason other than that he'd asked, and that asking had been enough. He turned back to the room, to the work being done at his table, to the testimony being organized in Sandra's careful hands, to the shoebox of evidence that Ray Delgado had kept for 8 months, not knowing if anyone would ever need it, to Gary Finch, who had come to a meeting he was afraid to attend and had stayed for 6 hours and would stay until it was finished, to Jessica, who had gone back to the woman in the corner and was writing something down, the specific handwriting that Frank had always thought looked like architecture, permanent and load-bearing. He reached into his pocket and felt the shape of the phone that had made one call 23 days ago and changed everything. Then he went back to the table and got back to work, because the day wasn't finished. And neither was Frank Callahan. Agent Velez worked through Sandra's documentation for 40 minutes without stopping, and the room held itself in the particular quiet of people who understand that something important is happening and that talking would interrupt it. Sandra stood beside her the entire time, turning pages when Velez nodded, pointing to specific entries, when Velez asked answering questions in the clipped, precise language of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation in her head for 14 months. Frank watched from across the room and didn't interfere. This was Sandra's moment as much as it was anyone's. She'd carried those records alone in a leather portfolio and a locked drawer for over a year, not knowing if they'd ever be needed, not knowing if anyone would ever sit across from her and treat them as the serious evidence they were. Watching Velez handle each page with the careful attention of someone who recognized its weight, Frank thought about what it costs a person to keep believing in something when there's no visible sign that the belief is going anywhere. It costs everything, and Sandra Hooper had paid it without complaint. At 2:47, Velez set the last page down, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then looked at Frank. "This is enough," she said. The room exhaled. Gary Finch made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. Tom Eckert uncrossed his arms for the first time in hours. Jessica, who'd been sitting with her back straight and her hands in her lap with the disciplined stillness of someone managing a lot of feeling, very carefully closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. Sandra just nodded once, as if she'd known all along and had only been waiting for someone official to confirm it. Enough for what, specifically, Frank said, because he needed it said plainly. Enough to execute the warrant we've had pending since March, Velez said. Enough to freeze his accounts. Enough to prevent the restructuring his lawyer has been engineering for the past 3 weeks. She looked at her phone. My teams have been waiting for my call. The moment I make it, this becomes a federal matter, and Whitmore loses every piece of maneuvering room he's been saving for himself. Then make the call, Frank said. She already had the phone to her ear. Frank stepped back and let her work and looked at the room again. Really looked at it and understood something he hadn't fully articulated to himself before this moment. He'd thought of this as his fight, his response to Whitmore, his decision to make the call, his gathering of people and evidence and testimony. And it was in the sense that he'd been the one who started it. But somewhere between Gary Finch showing up at the side door with cold hands and Sandra Hooper sliding a manila folder across a desk, it had stopped being his and become theirs. He'd just been the first one willing to say out loud what everyone else had been thinking in their own isolated darkness. That was all it had ever taken. Someone willing to go first. Deke appeared in the doorway from outside, and when Frank looked at him, Deke raised his chin slightly in a question. What's the word? Frank held up one finger. 1 more minute. Deke nodded and leaned against the doorframe and watched the room with the patient alertness of a man who'd spent decades in situations where readiness mattered and fidgeting was expensive. Velez finished her call. She turned to the group with an expression that was professional and controlled and had just barely at the edges something that looked like relief. The warrant is being executed at the county sheriff's department right now, she said. 2 of my colleagues are meeting with the county commissioner within the hour. Deputy Whitmore's personal accounts were frozen 6 minutes ago. She paused. He doesn't know any of that yet. When will he know? Tom asked. Soon, Velez said. When it hits his phone, when his lawyer calls. She looked at Frank. The question is what he does when he finds out. He'll come here, Frank said without hesitation. Everyone looked at him. He doesn't have anywhere else to go, Frank continued. His money's frozen, his department is being searched, his leverage is gone. The only play he has left is to try to confront this directly, to try to make it look like he's still in control of something. He paused. He'll come here because this is where it started for him. This is the place he underestimated. Velez studied him. And if he does, then he walks into 590 witnesses, Frank said. And whatever he does it with more people watching than he's ever faced in his life. He came at 4:15. Frank knew it was happening before he heard the patrol car because Deke appeared in the doorway and said simply, incoming, and turned back outside, and the shift in the ambient presence of the crowd was palpable. Not tension exactly, but a collective attention. The specific change in atmosphere when 500 people orient toward the same point simultaneously. Frank walked to the doorway and stood there. Whitmore came on foot this time. He'd parked somewhere out of sight and walked, which told Frank more than the walking itself. It told him that some tactical instinct had survived in Whitmore, even now. Some part of his thinking that understood arriving in a patrol car in front of 500 people was a bad image. He was in uniform still, but it was the same uniform from this morning, the shirt less pressed now, and something about the way he moved was different from every previous time Frank had seen him. The performance was going, the machinery of authority that he'd been running for 12 years, the practiced posture and the calibrated voice, and the specific smile that wasn't warm and wasn't cold, but existed in the precise space that gave him maximum flexibility. All of it was still there, but underneath it, something had slipped. He walked toward the garage and the crowd watched him, and nobody moved and nobody spoke, and the silence was enormous. He stopped 15 feet from Frank. You think you won something, he said. Frank looked at him. I think some people got their lives back, he said. That's what I think. This isn't what it looks like to you. Whitmore's voice had the tight, effortful control of a man working very hard to project something he no longer fully felt. Whatever that agent told you, whatever deal she offered people in exchange for whatever they think they saw, it's more complicated than, Caleb, Frank said it quietly. Your accounts are frozen. Your department is being searched right now. Your lawyer knows. You know. He let that sit for a moment. There's nothing here for you. Whatever you came to do, you can't do it. Whitmore went very still. The silence stretched. Around them, 590 people stood and watched and said nothing, and the weight of that watching was different from anger, different from threat. It was something harder to manage than either of those something that Whitmore had no tool for. It was simply witness, simply the absolute refusal to look away. I built something here, Whitmore said, and his voice cracked on the last word, just barely, just enough to be heard. 12 years, You built fear, Frank said, and you built it on people who didn't have anyone to help them. And when someone helped them, it fell apart in 3 weeks. He kept his voice level. He didn't want to be cruel. He'd never wanted that. That's not a legacy, Caleb. That's a structure with no foundation. Something in Whitmore's face shifted then, not to anger as Frank had expected, but to something rawer, something that had the awful quality of a man glimpsing himself clearly for possibly the first time in years. It lasted only a moment. Then his jaw set and his eyes went flat, and the performance came back up like a shutter closing. You'll regret this, he said. No, Frank said. I won't. They stood looking at each other, and then the younger officer, the one from this morning, the one who'd pulled out his phone and walked away from Whitmore's patrol car, came through the crowd from the north side of the road. He was out of uniform, which meant he'd gone home and changed, which meant he'd made a decision since this morning that had required more than just walking away. He walked past Whitmore without looking at him, came to where Frank was standing, and stopped. My name is Officer Danny Reeves, he said to Frank, and his voice was steadier than his face. I've been with the county department for 4 years. I've seen things I should have reported a long time ago. He swallowed. I'd like to talk to Agent Velez. Whitmore's face went through 5 expressions in 2 seconds. Frank stepped aside and gestured toward the garage interior. She's inside, he said to Reeves. Reeves walked past. Whitmore watched him go, and something broke behind his eyes cleanly, the way ice breaks. Not gradually, not with warning, just a sound and then it's done. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, and the crowd watched him go, all 590 of them, and not one person said a word, because what was there to say? The thing spoke for itself. The next 90 minutes were the most active Frank had experienced in years, possibly ever. Ever not physical activity, but the dense, rapid activity of a situation coming apart at the seams and needing to be held in shape while it did. Officer Danny Reeves sat at Frank's work table and talked to Agent Velez for 40 minutes. Frank sat at the far end and didn't listen closely, not because he wasn't curious, but because it wasn't his to hear. Reeves was giving what Reeves had on Reeves's own terms, and Frank's presence at that table was already enough of a witness. He kept his eyes on the door, on the room, on the steady small activity of people arriving and being received and being given coffee and being heard, because they kept coming. Not in the same numbers as the morning rush. Not the flood of 11 people in 4 hours, but steadily ones and twos, knocking at the side door and asking if this was the place where people were talking to someone. Jessica handled most of them at first, and then Sandra started helping her. And by 5 in the afternoon, they had a quiet, functional system where Jessica took first contact and Sandra organized documentation, and Velez's 2 colleagues who had drifted in from wherever they'd been stationed without announcement circulated through the room, taking formal statements. Gary Finch had stopped looking like a man carrying something heavy. He'd been sitting in his chair through most of it, and somewhere around 3:30, he'd started talking to the people as they arrived, not formally, not as any kind of representative, just as someone who knew what they were going through because he'd been going through it, and who could say so in the specific way that one tired person tells another tired person that the tired is almost over. Frank watched Gary doing that, and thought about the man who'd come to his garage 8 days ago with both hands around a coffee mug like it was the only warm thing in the world. People were not static. That was the thing Whitmore had never understood. He'd frozen them in the positions of their fear and assumed the frozen positions were who they were. He'd never accounted for what happened when someone came along and said, "You're not alone, and here's proof." Tom Eckert had gotten on the phone at some point, and Frank didn't know who he was calling until Ray Delgado came through the door with 2 men. Frank didn't recognize who Ray introduced as Alan Marsh from the county planning board and a property developer named Carrie Sims who'd had dealings with Whitmore 18 months ago that she'd never been able to prove were corrupt. Tom had called Tom's network the deep, interconnected small-town web of people who knew people who knew people, and Tom's network had responded. Sandra, at a certain point, ran out of room in her portfolio. One of Velez's colleagues provided an evidence box. Sandra looked at the evidence box for a moment with the expression of a woman considering a container, then began transferring materials into it with careful, methodical hands. Frank went outside at 4:45. The crowd was thinner than the morning peak. Some people had left when the immediate weight of the day lifted slightly, gone for food, gone to check on things, the practical needs of 500 people who'd ridden a long way requiring eventual address. But there were still hundreds present, standing or sitting or talking in small groups, with the ease of people who'd been together long enough to stop being strangers. Some of them Frank knew slightly, most he didn't. Dake was standing near the road talking to a woman with gray hair and a long braid who looked like she'd been riding for as many decades as Frank had been alive. When he saw Frank come out, he ended the conversation and came over. "Velez's people are arresting someone at the department," Deke said quietly. "Heard it on someone's scanner. Whitmore. Or someone connected to him," Frank said. Deke nodded. "Town feels different," he said. Frank looked at the road, at the people at Red Valley in the late afternoon light. "Yeah," he said, "it does. You feel it too." Frank thought about how to say it accurately. "It feels like a window open," he said, "like air got in somewhere it hadn't been in a long time." Deke looked at him sideways. "Poetic." "Shut up." Deke laughed, the same laugh Frank remembered, short, genuine, gone, before it overstayed its welcome. Then he was quiet for a moment and said, "How are you, Stone? Really, not the town, you." Frank thought about that. "I'm okay," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know." Frank looked at the garage wall at the door, at the nail where the vest hung inside, but that he could picture exactly. "I spent 20 years believing that the best thing I could do with what I knew was put it down and walk away from it. That peace was the answer, and the answer was peace. And if I was just steady and quiet and careful, the world would leave me alone. And the world doesn't work like that." He paused. "It never worked like that. I just got lucky enough that it took 20 years to prove it to me." Deke said nothing, which was the right response. "I don't regret it," Frank said. "The 20 years, I needed them. I needed to learn how to build something instead of just defend something. But I think I was wrong that leaving was the same as being done." He paused. "You don't get to be done. Not really. You just get to choose which version of yourself does the work." Deke was quiet for a long moment. Then Tommy Reyes used to say something like that. Frank felt the name like a hand on his shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "He did." They stood together in the cooling air and didn't say anything else, and it was enough. The call that changed the day's final shape came at 5:23. Frank's phone, Agent Velez's number. He answered immediately. "Velez." "Frank." Her voice had the brisk, satisfied quality of a person calling with news they've been waiting to deliver. "Whitmore's attorney called the department 40 minutes ago and asked to arrange a voluntary surrender." Frank went still. "Say that again." "His lawyer called. Whitmore is willing to come in voluntarily. Tonight." A pause. "His accounts are frozen. He has nowhere to go. And apparently when he walked back from wherever he went this afternoon, he sat in his car for 90 minutes and then called his lawyer and said." She paused again, and Frank could hear her choosing the next words. "He said he was done." The word landed differently than Frank had expected. Not with triumph, with something quieter, the specific weight of an ending that had been a long time coming for everyone involved, including the man it was ending for. "What happens now?" Frank said. "Tonight processing. Tomorrow arraignment. It's going to take months to build the full case for trial. Financial crimes always do. But we have more than enough to hold him. And with what Officer Reeves provided this afternoon, we have enough to ensure that anyone inside that department who was covering for him is going to have a very uncomfortable few weeks." She paused. "You should know Reeves gave us something we hadn't anticipated." "What?" "Whitmore has been recording his own conversations. For years, he did it as insurance, his own insurance against the people he was working with, in case anyone ever tried to turn on him and he needed leverage. His lawyer apparently informed him this afternoon that those recordings, which he'd been counting on as protection, are now evidence that we can use against him instead. A beat, his own recordings, his own voice. Frank sat down on the bench outside the side door and exhaled slowly. He recorded himself, he said, 12 years of insurance. Velez said that just became 12 years of evidence. There it was, the thing Frank hadn't known to look for, the thing that had been sitting in Whitmore's own hands all this time. His own paranoia turned against him. His own need for control become the instrument of his unraveling. You couldn't write it. You couldn't plan for it. It was simply the way certain things ended, not with the neat resolution you'd engineered, but with the resolution that the truth engineered for itself. He went back inside and told the room. The reaction was not what television would have you expect. There was no cheering. There was no explosion of celebration. What happened instead was quieter and more real. Gary Finch put his face in his hands for the second time that day, and this time when he took them away, he was crying briefly and without embarrassment, the way a man cries when something that's been pressing on his chest for over a year is suddenly and completely lifted. Tom Eckert said good in a voice that was barely audible. Sandra Hooper opened her portfolio and wrote something at the top of a blank page and closed it again, and Frank, catching a glimpse of what she'd written, saw that it was just the date and the time, for the record. Because Sandra Hooper documented things good and terrible alike, because the record was how the truth stayed true. Jessica came to find him when the room had settled to a lower key. People still talking, but quieter now. The sustained intensity of the day beginning to release its pressure. She came and stood beside him the way she'd been standing beside him all day, close, attentive, but not needing anything from him. Just choosing to be in proximity the way people choose to be, near the thing that gives them a sense of where they are. You okay? She said. People keep asking me that today. People keep meaning it today. She looked at him. So, you okay? He thought about it. Tired, he said. Good tired. The kind where you're tired because you actually did something. Yeah, she looked at the room. Frank, all those people today, the ones who came in, some of them I didn't know were going through what they were going through, and they've been coming to this garage for years. I know. How do you sit with that, knowing they were right here and suffering, and you didn't know? It was a real question. She wasn't accusing him. She was trying to understand something genuinely the way she always tried to understand things directly without softening the edge of it. You sit with it by doing something about it when you find out, Frank said. That's the only way. You can't carry guilt for what you didn't know. You can only carry a responsibility for what you do with it once you know. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, yeah, I can work with that. Outside, the sound of motorcycles starting up began gradually as the evening came on. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in the natural way of people who'd come a long way and had a long way to go home and knew the road was best started while there was still some light. The departures were unhurried. People came to the garage door and found Frank, some of them men he hadn't seen in 15 or 20 years, and they shook his hand or embraced him or just looked at him for a moment with the specific look of someone saying something they don't need words for. Some of the riders he'd never met before, younger people who'd come because Deke had called, and Deke's call was enough. One of them, a woman who couldn't have been more than 35 with a quiet face and capable hands, stopped in the doorway and said to Frank, I didn't know you, but Deke told me what you did for your people back before I was writing. He said you were the one who always showed up. She paused. Now I know what he meant. She was gone before Frank could answer, which was fine. He didn't have an answer worth saying anyway. Deke was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway with both hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Frank across the garage for a moment. You still got our number, he said. I've still got your number, Frank said. You won't wait 20 years next time. It wasn't a question. Frank took it as the statement it was. No, he said, I won't. Deke nodded once. He looked at Jessica, who was at the work table talking with one of Velez's colleagues. He looked at Gary Finch, who had finally, sometime in the past hour, stopped looking like a man carrying something and started looking like a man who'd put it down. He looked around the garage at the tools hung in careful rows, at the coffee maker older than some of the motorcycles, at the nail on the wall. Keep the vest, he said, not loudly, almost to himself. Then he walked out, and a minute later, Frank heard his engine turn over, and a minute after that, the sound of it was gone down the road toward the highway. Frank stood in the quiet garage and looked at the room. Sandra was packing up her portfolio. Gary was on his phone talking to someone in a low voice that had warmth in it, his wife Frank guessed, finally telling her something true. Tom had his jacket on and was shaking hands with one of Velez's colleagues and nodding at whatever he was being told. Jessica was still at the work table finishing something she was writing, and she had the particular focus she brought to things that mattered, the kind that made the world around her recede. The day had started with 590 motorcycles and a phone call and the weight of 3 weeks of quiet building, and it was ending in a garage in Red Valley, Montana, with people packing up their things and talking in low voices, and a window somewhere that had been closed for years standing open. Frank made himself a cup of coffee, the old coffee maker cycling the way it always cycled, and sat at his work table and didn't try to make it more than it was or less than it was. It was enough. It was more than enough. Agent Velez came to find him before she left. She stood across the table and looked at him with an expression that was fully professional, except at the very edges of it where something more personal had gotten in. "Frank," she said, "off the record." "Off the record," he agreed. "I've been working on Whitmore for 7 months. I've had financial analysts and document specialists and field observers and the full weight of a federal agency behind this. And you did more in 3 weeks working out of a garage with a legal pad and a cell phone than we did in 7 months." She paused. "I need to understand how." Frank looked at his coffee. "You were looking for evidence," he said. "I was looking for people. That's the difference." She thought about that for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag, and at the door she turned back once. "Thank you," she said. "Thank the people who showed up," he said. "All of them." She left and the garage was quiet, and Frank Callahan sat alone in the place he'd built and tended for 11 years with a cup of coffee, going slowly cold, and let the day settle into him. Part 5. The garage was never completely quiet after that Saturday. Something had changed in its atmosphere, not noisily, not in any way Frank could point to specifically, but the way a room changes after something significant has happened in it, the way the air holds a different quality, the way you walk into it and feel without knowing exactly why that this is a place where things matter. The Monday after was the first sign. Frank opened at 7 as he always did, and by 7:15, there were 3 people waiting who hadn't called ahead. Not customers or not only customers. Ray Delgado from the hardware store came to bring back the shoebox Frank had returned to him the previous week with every document inside because Ray had said he wanted Frank to keep copies. He also brought coffee from the diner 2 blocks down, 3 cups in a cardboard carrier, and he set them on the front counter and looked around the garage with the expression of a man seeing a place differently than he ever had before. "Never told my wife," Ray said without preamble. "About Whitmore, about the payments, about any of it." Frank poured the coffee into mugs instead of taking the to-go cups because in his garage you sat down. "When did you tell her?" "Saturday night after I got home." He wrapped both hands around the mug. She cried, not because she was angry at me, because she was relieved it was over and sad I'd been carrying it alone and angry at him. All of it at once, the way she feels things, everything at the same time. He shook his head. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I didn't have a good answer. "Fear makes people protect the people they love by not telling them things," Frank said. "It's not logic, it's instinct. Bad instinct." "Most fear is," Frank said. Ray was quiet for a moment, turning the mug. "She also said I should come here and say thank you, so..." He looked at Frank. "Thank you." Frank nodded. He didn't offer anything about how it was nothing or how Ray didn't need to thank him, because Ray did need to say it, and a person who needed to say something deserved a listener who didn't deflect it. The second person waiting that morning was a woman Frank knew only slightly. Mid-50s, ran a small alteration shop on 4th Street, had been a peripheral presence in his life for years in the way that people are in small towns, familiar faces without full stories. Her name was Helen Marsh, no relation to Alan from the planning board. She'd heard about Saturday from a neighbor and had come to ask directly, and without embarrassment, whether it was too late to be part of whatever was being built. Frank sat her down with coffee and called Agent Velez's direct number, which Velez had given him before leaving Saturday, with instructions to pass it to anyone who hadn't yet come forward. He handed Helen the phone, went to the back bay to give her privacy, and worked on a carburetor for 40 minutes while she talked. When he came back in, Helen was sitting with both hands flat on the table and her eyes red but her chin up. "She wants me to come in this week," Helen said, "to the federal office in Helena. Can you get there?" My sister can drive me. She paused. I've been sitting on this for 8 months, Frank. 8 months of telling myself there was nothing to be done, that people like him always win. She looked at him. Was I wrong about that, or did something specific change? Frank thought about how to answer it honestly. You weren't wrong that people like him usually win, he said. They usually do. What changed was enough people decided not to let him win anymore. All at the same time, which is the only thing that ever actually changes it. Helen nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Okay, I can live with that. The third person that Monday morning was Danny Reeves. He came in at 9 out of uniform, which Frank was now realizing was going to be his permanent state for a while. He'd been placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation into the department, along with 6 other officers, though Velez had already told Frank that Reeves was categorized differently from the others as a cooperating witness rather than a subject. He sat down across from Frank and put both hands flat on the work table the same way Helen had, and Frank wondered if it was a posture people naturally assumed when they were about to say something that cost them something. I should have done something sooner, Reeves said. Probably, Frank said. Reeves looked up, surprised by the directness. Frank had decided not to soften it because Danny Reeves was 28 years old and had the rest of his career ahead of him, and the most useful thing Frank could do for him right now was tell him the truth rather than the comfort. But sooner was harder than now, Frank continued. Now you had 590 people standing in the road. Sooner you had nothing except your own conscience and a department culture that would have buried you. He looked at Reeves steadily. You made the call you could make when you could make it. The question isn't whether you were brave enough on Saturday. The question is what you do from here. Reeves was quiet for a long time. I don't know if I still have a career in law enforcement, he said. That depends on what kind of career you want, Frank said. If you want the kind Whitmore had, then no, probably not. If you want a different kind, he paused. There are good departments. There are good people in this work. It's not the work that was the problem. It's the people who corrupt it, Reeves said. Yes. Another silence. Then Reeves said, with the careful honesty of someone who wasn't used to this kind of conversation. Can I ask you something? The vest on the wall. Dake told me who you were before the garage. Frank looked at him. What's the question? How do you walk away from something like that and stay, I don't know, whole? How do you put down something that was that big a part of you and still be yourself? It was the most personal question anyone had asked Frank in years, and it came from a 28-year-old who was trying to figure out how to do what Frank had done 2 decades ago from the opposite direction, not leaving a brotherhood, but leaving a corrupted institution, not putting down loyalty, but escaping complicity. Frank looked at the wall, at the nail. You don't put down who you are, he said. You put down what was hurting who you are. There's a difference. He paused. I didn't leave because I stopped believing in loyalty or protection or standing for people who need someone to stand for them. I left because the context I was doing it in was costing more than it was worth. Another pause. When I opened this garage, I kept doing the same things, just differently. Helping people who needed help. Standing when I needed to stand. The what never changed, only the how. Reeves absorbed that. So you never really left, he said. I relocated, Frank said. Reeves almost smiled. It was brief and real and made him look younger than 28, which he already was. Okay, he said. Okay, I think I understand. You'll understand more in 10 years, Frank said. That's how understanding works. You get it in layers. Onion. The arraignment happened on a Tuesday. Frank wasn't there. He hadn't planned to go, and he didn't. He heard about it from Agent Velez, who called him at noon with the clipped professional satisfaction he'd come to recognize in her voice when things went the way she'd engineered them to go. Whitmore had arrived in a suit with his lawyer and had stood in the federal courtroom with his back straight and his face empty of everything except the performance of composure, which was itself a kind of evidence. The performance was all that was left. The financial charges alone were enough to hold him without bail. The recordings, his own recordings, were entered into the preliminary record. He didn't look at anyone in the gallery, Velez said. A lot of people from Red Valley came. Gary Finch was there. Sandra Hooper, the family from the trailer park that Jessica found both adults, came. Frank was quiet for a moment. How did he look when he heard the recordings entered? Like a man who had convinced himself until that moment that something was going to save him, and then realized it wasn't. A pause. Not the reaction you'd expect. Not anger. More like deflation. Like something that had been holding him up finally stopped working. Frank understood that, actually. He'd seen the cracks beginning to show for weeks. The brittleness. The way the performance had been requiring more and more effort to maintain as what it was performing against became less stable. By the time it collapsed, it had probably been exhausting to be Caleb Whitmore for quite a while. What happens to the department? Frank asked. 6 officers on administrative leave, 2 of them likely facing their own charges. The county commissioner has retained counsel, which means he's worried, which means we'll be talking to him next week. She paused. The good news is that the deputy who succeeds Whitmore in the interim has been in that department for 9 years, and by every account we have, which is substantial at this point, has never participated in any of it. His name is Marcus Webb. He actually filed 2 internal complaints about Whitmore 3 years ago that were buried. Marcus Webb, Frank said. He didn't know the man, but he made a note. He's worth knowing, Velez said. He'll be the one rebuilding that department, and he's going to need people in this town to trust him while he does it. I'll talk to Gary and Tom, Frank said, and Sandra. Good. A pause. Frank, this case is going to take 18 months to fully prosecute. Maybe longer. There are going to be moments where it looks like it might stall or compromise. I need you to be a steady presence in that town while it moves. I'm not going anywhere, Frank said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you instead of warning you. The twist came on a Thursday, 11 days after the Saturday that had changed everything, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. Frank was in the back bay working when Jessica came through the door with a particular expression on her face. Not alarm, not quite, but the specific alertness she showed when something had arrived that she hadn't yet figured out how to categorize. There's someone here, she said, not a customer. Who? She says her name is Patricia Whitmore, Caleb's wife. Frank set down his tools slowly. He'd known Whitmore was married small town. You knew things like that without particularly trying. But Patricia Whitmore had been so thoroughly absent from everything that had happened that she'd barely registered as a factor. She come alone, he said. Yes, she's been sitting in her car for 20 minutes before she came in. I watched her from the front window. Frank went to the front. Patricia Whitmore was 42, dark-haired, with a face that had a quality he recognized immediately because he'd spent the past month looking at faces with similar qualities. The look of someone who has been managing something private and heavy for a very long time. She was sitting in one of the customer chairs with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on him as he came in, and she didn't flinch and didn't look away, which told him something important before she said a word. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Patricia, she said. Her voice was controlled but not cold. I don't use that name the way it used to sound. She paused. I know who you are. I know what happened. I was there on Saturday. I mean, not here, but I drove past. I parked on a side street and watched for a while. Another pause. I've known what he was doing for 4 years. Frank kept his face neutral. 4 years. Not all of it, not the full scope, but enough. She held his gaze. I want you to know that I didn't participate in any of it. I want to know if I'm believed when I say that or if I believe you, Frank said. She exhaled. Not with relief exactly, it was more complicated than relief. I tried twice to get him to stop, not to leave the department, not to confess to anything, just to stop. The first time he told me I was imagining it. The second time he told me that if I ever said anything about it to anyone, he would make sure I lost custody of our daughter. Her jaw tightened. She's 11. Her name is Lily. Frank was quiet for a moment. Are you safe right now? You and your daughter. He's in custody, Patricia said. So for the first time in a while, yes. Something moved across her face, complicated, layered, the specific grief of a person whose relief and loss are completely tangled together. I'm not here to ask you for anything. I'm not here to defend him. I'm here because, she stopped and started again. I'm here because what you did changed something in this town, and I have been living in this town under the weight of what he was doing. And you deserve to know that there are people who were suffering inside his house too, not just outside it. Frank looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Does your daughter know any of what's happening? She knows her father is in trouble. She doesn't know the details. A pause. She's a good kid. She deserves better than what she was given as an example of how a person in authority behaves. She's got you, Frank said. That's not nothing. Patricia Whitmore looked at him with an expression that was raw and real and unguarded, the way people look when they haven't been told something simple and true in a long time. Thank you, she said quietly. That's actually, she stopped. Thank you. She left 10 minutes later, and then Jessica came to stand beside Frank in the front room after the door closed, and neither of them said anything for a while. There's always more inside the story than you can see from outside it, Jessica said finally. Always, Frank said. What happens to them? Her and the daughter. That's up to them, Frank said. But they've got one less weight now. Whatever they do with that is theirs to figure out. Jessica nodded. She was quiet another moment. Then Frank, I've been thinking about something. Tell me. She turned to face him. The families in the trailer park, the ones I found. 3 of them came forward last week and gave statements, but 4 of them didn't. And I've been thinking about why they didn't, and I think it's not fear exactly anymore. It's more that they don't know that the system that was supposed to protect them is actually going to work differently now. They've never had evidence of that. They've only had evidence that it doesn't. That's accurate, Frank said. So what do we do about that? He looked at her. She was asking him, but she also wasn't. She already knew the shape of what she thought should be done and was checking it against him the way she checked complex diagnoses against his longer experience. What do you want to do about it? She'd been waiting for that question. I want to go back. I want to go back and talk to the 4 who didn't come forward, and this time I want to bring Marcus Webb with me, the new deputy, so they can see that there's an actual person in that position who is different. Not just hear about it, see it. Frank thought about what Velez had said about Marcus Webb needing people in town to trust him while he rebuilt. About the fact that trust didn't come from announcements. It came from specific, repeated acts of being trustworthy in front of people who had reason to doubt. Have you talked to Webb? Frank asked. Not yet, Jessica said. I wanted to talk to you first. I'll call Velez and get his number, Frank said. If he's the person she thinks he is, he'll say yes. Marcus Webb said he's inside 40 seconds of Jessica explaining what she was proposing. Frank wasn't on the call. Jessica made it herself, but he heard her side of it from the back bay. And what he heard was a 26-year-old woman talking to a county law enforcement officer as an equal with the specific confidence of someone who had learned in the past 3 weeks that confidence was something you grew into by doing the thing that required it. When she hung up, she came to the bay door and said, "He wants to go Wednesday." "Then you go Wednesday," Frank said. "You're not coming." "No," Frank said. "That one's yours." She looked at him. He could see her understanding it, that he was giving her the thing he'd given to everyone over the past weeks, the thing that turned out to be more valuable than any specific help he could have provided the space to be the one who went first. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I've got it." Breathe. 3 weeks after the arraignment, Sandra Hooper came to the garage with a bottle of good whiskey and 2 glasses and set them on Frank's work table without explanation, which was explanation enough. Frank poured. Sandra sat. The county commissioner settled, she said. Civil penalties, cooperation agreement, no criminal charges, which is less than he deserves, but more than he had yesterday. She looked at her glass. Velez says it frees up their resources to focus on the criminal prosecution without a parallel civil fight. She's probably right, Frank said. She usually is. Sandra picked up her glass. Also, Ray Delgado got a letter this week from the county property office. His business license renewal was approved retroactively for the period it was improperly delayed, and they're refunding the additional fees he paid. She paused. Tom Eckert got something similar for the permit issues. Frank nodded. He'd heard about Tom's already. Gary Finch got his money back, Sandra said. All of it. 14 months of payments plus interest, which is being structured as restitution out of Whitmore's frozen accounts. She stopped. He called me when he got the notification. He said he didn't know whether to cash the check or frame it. Frank almost smiled. What did you tell him? I told him to cash it and take his wife to dinner, somewhere she'd always wanted to go. Sandra looked at him over her glass. He took her to Billings, stayed 3 nights. First real vacation they've had in 4 years. Frank picked up his glass. They sat in the quiet of the garage, the coffee maker cycling, the tools on the walls in their careful rows, and didn't need to say anything more for a while. Sandra broke the silence eventually. Frank, the families in the trailer park, 4 of them came forward last week. After Jessica and Webb went out there, Frank looked up. All 4. All 4. Sandra's expression was the closest to warmth that Sandra Hooper's precise and careful face regularly got. Webb apparently sat down with each family individually and did something, I don't know exactly what, but from what Jessica told me, he basically just listened, for as long as it took, without a notepad, without his phone, without trying to get to the next thing. She paused. Jessica said one of the mothers cried for 20 minutes and Webb just sat there and let her, and didn't try to move it along or fix anything, just bore witness. Frank set his glass down. He thought about Marcus Webb sitting in a trailer in Red Valley with a mother crying for 20 minutes. Not deflecting, not rushing, just staying present for something that needed a person present for it. He'll be all right, Frank said. That department will be all right. Because of him? Because of him and because of the people around him. Frank looked at Sandra. That's the only way anything is ever all right. It's never one person. It's always the people around them. Sandra considered that. Then she refilled both glasses. To the people around them, she said. To the people around them, Frank agreed. The moment Frank had not let himself fully anticipate arrived on a Friday afternoon, 7 weeks after the Saturday that had started it all, and it arrived without announcement in the form of a car Frank didn't recognize pulling up, and a man getting out who Frank recognized immediately, even though he hadn't seen him in 11 years. His name was Carl Briggs. He was 68, stocky, gray-headed, with a walk that said former military and a face that said he'd found something better to do with himself after. He'd been the one Frank had called that night 3 weeks before everything, the voice on the other end that had said, "Give me 24 hours." He'd been the coordinator, the one who'd made the other calls, who'd organized what became 590 people in a town he'd never been to, for a man he hadn't spoken to in 11 years. Frank came out of this garage and stood in the lot, and they looked at each other across the distance, and Carl covered it in 10 steps, and they shook hands, which became an embrace which lasted long enough to mean something. "You didn't come on Saturday," Frank said when they separated. "I organized it," Carl said. "I wasn't needed for it. You had Deke." He looked at Frank steadily. "I came now because the thing I needed to see wasn't the arrival. It was what was still standing after." They went inside. Frank made coffee. Carl sat at the work table and looked around the garage at the tools, the coffee maker, the general evidence of 11 years of steady work, and then looked at the vest on the nail. "You always kept it," Carl said. "Always," Frank said. "I told people you would. Some of them thought you'd leave everything behind completely. I told them they didn't know you." He looked at the vest for another moment. "A man who keeps the vest doesn't leave. He just changes what he's doing." "Is that the philosophy?" Frank said. "That's the observation," Carl said. "Philosophy's for people with more time than I've got." He looked at Frank. "How's the town?" "Healing," Frank said. "That's the right word for it. It doesn't happen fast, and it doesn't happen uniformly, and there are days where someone's still scared or still angry or still carrying something they haven't figured out how to put down yet. But it's happening," he paused. "That's all healing ever is, really. Just happening slowly in the direction of better." Carl nodded. "And you?" Frank thought about that question, which everyone had been asking him, and which he'd been answering in fragments. Good, tired, okay, I'm fine, without quite landing on the full truth of it. He tried now. "I spent 20 years thinking the best version of myself was the quiet one," he said, "and the one who didn't ask much of the world and didn't let the world ask much of him. And I think I needed those years. I think they made me someone different, someone better in some ways than who I was before." He stopped. "But I also think I was wrong about what peace costs. I thought peace was what you got by withdrawing. It's not. Peace is what you get by building it, by being willing to stand up for it when it's threatened, by finding the people who need you, and being there by using what you know and who you are in service of something that matters." He looked at Carl. "I'm more at peace right now after the hardest 3 weeks I've had in 20 years than I was in the 10 years before it." Carl looked at him for a long moment. Then he said in the careful way of a man who doesn't say things carelessly, "Tommy Reyes would be proud of you." It hit Frank the way true things hit, not like a blow, but like something settling into place. He didn't try to deflect it or minimize it. He just let it be true. "Yeah," he said, "I think he would." Jessica came in through the side door and stopped when she saw Carl reading the room the way she always read rooms, quickly, accurately, adjusting her posture to the emotional weight of what she'd walked into. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know you had someone." "This is Carl," Frank said. "Carl, this is Jessica Miller. She runs this garage." Jessica looked at Frank. "I'm your employee." "You run this garage," Frank said. "There's a difference. I fix the motorcycles. You run everything else, and you're better at everything else than I am." Carl looked at Jessica with the particular attention of someone taking an accurate measure. "You were the one who found the families in the trailer park," he said. Jessica looked surprised that he knew. "Yes." "And the one who went back with the new deputy?" "Yes." Carl nodded slowly. "You're the reason this actually changes something long-term," he said. "Frank started it. You're the one who's going to keep it going. Those families trust you now. That deputy trusts you. That matters more than the arrest. The arrest is the news. What you're building is the actual thing." Jessica stood with that for a moment, and Frank watched her receive it, not deflecting it the way she might have a month ago, not minimizing it, but standing in it, the way someone stands in a truth they've been working toward and can now afford to acknowledge. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, I'll take that." Carl stayed for 3 hours. They talked, the three of them, around the work table with coffee, and then with the last of Sandra's whiskey, that Frank hadn't finished talking the way people talk when the emergency is over, and there's finally room to say things that aren't urgent. Carl told stories about people Frank knew, and some Frank had only heard about, and Jessica listened with the alert, respectful attention she gave to anyone who'd lived long enough to have things worth hearing. And Frank talked more than he'd talked in years, because the room had the quality that certain rooms have, the quality that made it safe to mean what you said. At 7 in the evening, Carl stood to go, and at the door he turned back and looked at the vest one more time. "You know," he said, "there's a case near the front door at the chapter hall in Billings. Glass, front, good light. Been empty for 3 years. The brothers have been arguing about what belongs in it." He looked at Frank. "I told them I had an idea. They told me to go find out if I was right." Frank looked at the vest on the nail. He crossed the room and lifted it off the nail, felt the weight of it, the worn leather, the patches that had their own geography of years and places and people. He carried it to the work table and laid it flat. Then he picked up his phone and took a photograph of it, sent it to Carl's number. Carl's phone buzzed. He looked at the photo. He looked at Frank. "Keep it," Frank said. "Put it in the case. Let people see it." He looked at the vest one more time. It was never mine to hold on to. It belonged to all of us. It always did. Carl folded the vest carefully and tucked it under his arm and walked out into the evening without another word, which was the right choice, because some things are said by the doing of them and lose something when words are added. Frank stood at the work table and looked at the empty nail on the wall. Jessica came to stand beside him. She looked at the nail. She looked at Frank. She looked at the nail again. "You okay?" she said. "Better than okay," he said. And this time it was true all the way down. She put her hand briefly on his arm, the quick, grounded gesture of someone who knew when to touch and when not to. And then she picked up her jacket and her keys and her bag. And at the door she stopped and looked back, the way Carl had looked back, the way everyone eventually looked back in this garage. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Same time tomorrow," Frank said. She left, and the garage settled around him, and Frank stood in the quiet of the place he'd built 11 years ago, with worn hands and a clear intention, in the specific faith of a man who believed that building something honest was its own protection. He looked at the empty nail. He looked at the rows of tools. He looked at the coffee maker, at the folding chairs, at the legal pad on the work table, still open to pages of careful notes that had helped bring down a man who had believed that fear was permanent. Fear wasn't permanent. That was what the past 7 weeks had proven, page by page and name by name and person by person, in a way that Frank knew he would carry the rest of his life. Fear looked permanent because it wore permanence as a costume, because the people who built structures on it needed you to believe it couldn't be moved. But it could. It always could. All it needed was the one person willing to stop believing the costume was real. Frank Callahan had been that person for Red Valley, Montana. He hadn't been special in any way that a person couldn't be. He'd just been willing to go first. He turned off the coffee maker. He turned off the bay lights. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. He'd built this garage on the belief that a strong man doesn't look for fights, but knows when he must stand. He tested that belief against the hardest thing his quiet years had given him to face, and it had held. Not because he was strong in the way the world usually measured strength, not because he was the loudest or the most powerful or the most feared, but because he was the kind of strong that had root to it, the kind that doesn't move when pressure is applied because it's already decided where it stands. That kind of strength didn't come from what you could do to people. It came from what you were willing to do for them. He locked the side door. He walked to his truck. He drove home through Red Valley in the evening past Riley's bar where Gary Finch's lights were on, and warm past Tom Eckert's parts distributor, past the street where Sandra Hooper's accounting firm would open in the morning with documentation systems that were now being quietly consulted by two other county businesses that wanted to protect themselves going forward. Past the south end of town where the trailer park families were sleeping with one less weight on their chests. The town was not fixed. Towns don't fix, not completely. They scar over, they compensate, they grow differently around the damage. But Red Valley was moving in the direction of itself toward the thing it could be without the structure of fear that had been holding it into a different shape. And in the morning, Frank Callahan would open Stone Creek Garage at 7 o'clock and make a pot of coffee in a machine older than some of the motorcycles he worked on, and hang his jacket on the hook by the door and pick up his tools and go to work. Because that was who he was. That had always been who he was. A man who showed up, a man who stayed, a man who, when the moment came, chose not to look away. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. It was more than enough, and it was his.